This is the new OnePlus 7 Pro. So as you probably know by now, OnePlus is a brand that dedicates itself to being innovative with their devices by giving you a lot more for a lot less, thus coining the term flagship killer over the past couple of years. With the brand becoming more mainstream in the US markets, more and more people are hearing the name OnePlus, and if you've ever considered switching to this brand in the past but haven't completely made the jump, then this device here, the OnePlus 7 Pro, is probably going to be the one that you should get, and here's why. This is one beautiful looking device with an extremely large 6.67 inch fluid AMOLED display with curved edges, and I'm not joking when I say that this is a huge phone. Now for someone like me who I would say has average size hands, yeah, this device was a little hard to hold with just one hand. I mean, it's possible, but I definitely did not feel comfortable holding the phone in one hand in fear of dropping it, so two hands is definitely the way to go here. But for me, that's okay because this is probably one of my favorite displays on any smartphone at the moment. OnePlus is finally bumping up their screen technology by giving us a resolution of 1440 by 3120 with a pixels per inch density of 516, which all of this of course translates to a wonderful viewing experience no matter what lighting condition you're in, what you're watching, or how you're watching it. And coupled with the stereo speakers that this phone has, the visual and audio experience on here is just fantastic. Now on top of that, the 7 Pro does have a refresh rate of 90 Hz, which allows for very fluid scrolling, hence the term fluid AMOLED display. And because of that refresh rate, scrolling through apps and browsing the web is very satisfying because of how smooth everything moves. The only downside to that high refresh rate is that it does end up using more battery life than the standard 60 Hz that we're used to on most smartphones. Of course, you are able to toggle between both refresh rates in the settings, but I typically just kept it at the 90 Hz because of the more enjoyable experience. Now, while the resolution on the display does cap out at 1140 by 3120, as I mentioned earlier, OnePlus does also provide the option to automatically switch between QHD Plus and Full HD Plus, that being a resolution of 2336 by 1080. But of course, you are able to pick and choose which resolution you'd prefer. With last year's OnePlus 6T, OnePlus made a very drastic design change compared to most phones on the market when they introduced the teardrop notch, a small, less intrusive notch that hardly took away from the viewing experience. Well, it wasn't enough. A notch is a notch, whether it's a teardrop notch, a traditional iPhone type notch, or a hole punch in the display like you'll see in the S10 series devices, a notch will always be a notch. So what did OnePlus decide to do this year? Well, they got rid of the notch completely. And this is how. Yes, that right there is the front-facing camera, and yes, it did pop up from the top of the phone, and yes, it is motorized. Now, OnePlus is not the first company to do something like this. However, they are the first to make this more accessible in the US market, being that this phone is available in T-Mobile stores. And at first, I was skeptical because, again, this is a motorized pop-up camera, and over time, it does have the possibility of suffering from mechanical breakdown. Now, the good thing is that OnePlus does claim that this motorized spring has been tested to work at least 300,000 times before giving out, which is most likely more than we'd ever use. So that's some good reassurance that this won't break on its own. But what about applied pressure, like opening up in your jeans? Or also, what happens when you drop your phone with the pop-up camera still activated? Well, OnePlus has an answer for this as well. This camera will automatically close when it senses pressure or when it senses a drop. Now, it's not recommended that you manually close the pop-up camera, but in the case that something like this does happen, it should be fine. Now, one of my biggest gripes with last year's OnePlus 6T is that although it had killer specs in every department, there was one thing that really kept that device from feeling like a true flagship killer, and that was the camera. You can't have a great flagship device without having a great camera, and while the 6T took some decent shots, it still lacked that high-end flagship quality. Well, things have definitely changed here with the 7 Pro. Not only do we have a primary 48 megapixel shooter on the back, but we also have a 16 megapixel wide angle lens and an 8 megapixel telephoto lens with 3x optical zoom. and the photos that these pictures take are very beautiful. A little less contrast and more on the warmer side than I personally like, but still clarity and detail is definitely there. I still wouldn't say that this camera produces flagship-like photos, but it definitely does a much better job and is a much better improvement from the 6T. And while it is great to have the additional wide-angle lens and the telephoto lens on this camera, unfortunately, they do not produce that great of pictures. I mean, they do, but the lighting has to be just right in order to keep the detail there. So while they're fun to mess around with, I would definitely suggest sticking with the main shooter just in case. Of course, we do also have different camera modes here on the 7 Pro, like portrait mode that works just like any other portrait mode that you would find on other devices. It works great, but it also does have trouble every now and then keeping the object in focus. And as for the video recording, the 7 Pro does output 4K video quality, and as you can expect, video quality on here is going to be very good as well. Again, we did get a much more improved primary shooter here on the 7 Pro, but it's still not good enough to really compare with, say, the Google Pixels of the world or the iPhones of the world. But this is a phone that costs up to $760, so really comparing it to some of those more expensive devices doesn't really seem that fair. And speaking of the price, yes, the 7 Pro is the most expensive OnePlus device to date. However, the hardware that it's rocking is on par with some of the $1,000 phones out on the market today. So running through the specs here, the 7 Pro is running on a Snapdragon 855, an Adreno 640 GPU, and for my particular model here, 8GB of RAM with 256GB of storage, which is the model that T-Mobile is selling at $700. But of course, there are different options to choose from on the OnePlus website, and on top of that, the 7 Pro is also running on Android Pie with Oxygen OS on top, which adds a few options for customization and a new screen recorder, finally. And powering the phone is a 4000 mAh battery, which is a pretty good sized battery, but being that this display uses a whole lot more power with that refresh rate and the higher resolution, battery life on here was not the best. I typically got around 4 hours of screen on time throughout my time of using the phone, and yeah, that's not really that good, at least for 2019 standards. Now, one thing I do love about this battery is the charging time. So the 7 Pro does have Warp Charge 3.0, and the charger here is extremely fast. I mean, you can get a full charge in about 20 minutes, which is amazing. Unfortunately, we still do not have wireless charging here on the 7 Pro, which of course is a bummer, but honestly guys, I think that Warp charging makes up for it completely. Now, aside from wireless charging not being on this phone, there are a few things that the 7 Pro doesn't have that might be a deal breaker for you. So the first is that there is still no certified rating for water resistance on this phone. OnePlus has been teasing that this phone can withstand water, but it hasn't officially been certified, mainly because they don't think it's worth the money. There have also been videos of other tech reviewers dropping the phone in a bucket of water. Now, I wouldn't recommend that you go out of your way to test it, but just know that if you do drop it in water, you should be fine. Aside from that, the only other thing that the 7 Pro doesn't have is a headphone jack, which it's 2019, so that's not something that we should really expect anymore. And again, those are the main differences with the 7 Pro, but what stayed the same with this model compared to the 6T? Well, aside from the really great build and hardware, we still have that in-display fingerprint reader that actually works a little bit faster this time. We have some pretty good stereo speakers and a very stock Android experience. I mean, the 7 Pro kept all of the good from the previous model while adding more to that experience. It's clear that OnePlus is still trying to change the game, and they definitely did that here with the 7 Pro. Not only do we have a beautiful large display, which is arguably the best on the market today, but we also get very powerful components, great battery charging, and 4 cameras on a $700 phone. This is easily my favorite phone to come out from OnePlus to date, and I'm very excited to see what they bring next. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this review on the OnePlus 7 Pro. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please make sure to give it a like and also subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment down below and I'll be sure to answer as many of them as possible. Aside from that, thank you guys so much for watching and I'll see you in the next video.